thoughts about political violence. It may be an opportune time to determine what your actual opinions are on the moral status of violence.
There's no place in America for this kind of violence, for any violence ever.
In reference to the recent assassination attempt on Trump. As many have observed, even if there's no place for this kind of violence, violence against prominent political figures with the protection of the state, there is a place for other kinds of violence. Because these very same leaders continue to condone and fund the genocide in Gaza and violently suppress protests, not to mention other modes of violent coercion that they consider implicitly to be central to the operations of government. We are used to the idea that the state is allowed to inflict violence. What are your thoughts on violence? It's a moment where there's a lot of revolutionary energy in a very literal, distinct, and even potentially violent way on both the right and the left. A lot of people on both sides of things, so to speak, are sometimes intimating that they'd be willing to condone revolutionary violence in certain contexts. When I ask myself this question, my response is that I oppose violence categorically. I oppose violence against human beings. But it's worthwhile to look deeper and ask myself why. Is this just an expression of my inset assumptions, my cowardice, my centrism, my privilege? It's very easy to hold certain values that you've never actually examined, and by examining these values, I think we can come into more coherence in our dialogue with one another. The word violence comes from the Latin violentia, which is in turn from the noun vis, meaning force or power. It was pretty much used in the same ways that we use it, denoting physical force that you use against someone, or in the more abstract sense of violating someone or something in a metaphorical sense, violating something sacred or causing somebody some personal outrage. Despite this overlap of meaning, the Roman state, both as a republic and in the imperial period, had a somewhat different attitude to violence than that which is being espoused by our current political leaders. Violence was explicitly and implicitly used to establish and maintain social order. It was a show of power and even a form of entertainment, as in the gladiatorial competitions. And it's true that Roman institutions were deeply influential in shaping our current political structures here in the US. Nonetheless, we do live in a world whose political rhetoric is shaped by a philosophy of nonviolence that largely comes from Christianity. The gladiatorial games did not die out in Rome until they were banned in the 4th century by the Emperor Constantine, and that entailed a new value system that categorically rejected violence. Nonviolence is central to the Christian message. There's many verses that you're probably familiar with. Blessed are the peacemakers. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say if anyone slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek also. But as the whole history of so-called Christian civilization indicates, this Christian value of nonviolence is often suppressed. Even philosophers relatively early in the Christian tradition, such as St. Augustine, develop theories of just war, that in certain situations physical violence is in fact condonable and still conformable to Christ's message. This notion of just uses of violence, even within Christian civilization, shows up in other places across the Western philosophical tradition. Various philosophers across that tradition develop theories of sovereign violence, these exceptional cases whereby it's appropriate for the persons in charge of the state to employ violence on the people within the state or in other states in order to maintain an overall safety. Thomas Hobbes, for instance, felt that the state in the first place was based on the fear of violence, and so the sovereign of the state, whoever is in charge of the state, is allowed to use violence to maintain the relative stability of the state that was formed because of the fear of violence in the first place. In the 20th century, the German philosopher Carl Schmitt, who was extremely influential on Nazism, is responsible for the concept of the state of emergency or state of exception, that situation where because of certain pressing dangers, the state is allowed to break its own laws in the name of enforcing its ultimate stability, which allows for state violence in the name of the public good. I mention all of these things just to account for the fact that we've allowed for a system where certain contradictions are able to exist. Because of our categorical opposition to violence, we allow certain forms of violence to happen, and our leaders condemn certain forms of violence while at the same time practicing violence.